You have microplastics in essentially every organ and tissue of your body right now, and you are constantly being bombarded with microplastics. So the challenge for me, and indeed for you as well, is to frame this topic of microplastics accurately. It's important that we understand they are out there, they are in us, and indeed, they can cause serious issues for our health. However, we also need to take agency. We need to understand how we can limit what's called the bioaccumulation of microplastics in our organs and tissues. And I don't want to be alarmist. What are microplastics? Microplastics, as the name suggests, are little itty bitty bits of plastic. How itty bitty? Well, microplastics range in size from 1 micron, which is 1/1000th of a millimeter, all the way up to 5 millimeters in diameter. Okay, so anything in that size range is considered a microplastic. Anything smaller than that, so anything smaller than 1 micron in diameter, 1/1000th of a millimeter in diameter, is considered a nanoplastic. And indeed, there are lots of microplastics floating around in the air. There are lots of nanoplastics floating around in the air. There's lots of both of those things in the ocean. There are a lot of those things in food, especially packaged food. There are a lot of those things lining cups. There are a lot of those things in everything that we consume, essentially. So what does it mean to have all these microplastics and nanoplastics floating around in our environment and going into our body through fluids and foods, etc.? Well, there is some serious concern because these microplastics potentially can disrupt cellular health, organ health, and could potentially lead to certain forms of disease. We'll talk about the ways they could potentially do that. However, I want to also emphasize that your body is incredibly good at dealing with foreign invaders. It's very good at getting rid of stuff that isn't good for it. However, microplastics and nanoplastics have been shown to lodge within specific tissues and stay there for long periods of time. Microplastics and nanoplastics would get into our body, right? If they're everywhere in our environment and we're inhaling them all day, then of course they'll get into our lungs, and then they're small enough they can get into our bloodstream. But as I mentioned, the body has these cleansing systems or these detoxification systems to remove things, but they're not removing the microplastics, or at least not all of them, from brain, testicle, and follicle. And I should point out that microplastics and nanoplastics are also found in all the other tissues of the body. In fact, I don't think there's a single investigation of human tissue or animal tissue for microplastics or nanoplastics where they didn't get a positive result, meaning where they didn't find them in the tissue. You can find them in not just the upper lungs, but in the lower lungs. So they're getting deposited in the lower lungs. You can find them in the bloodstream from a blood draw. You can find them in human placenta. And you can find them in what's called the meconium, which is the first stool that a baby takes. This is typically taken within the stool is taken. It's taken by the doctor. It's actually analyzed for various things. It contains bile and a bunch of other things. It's actually an important indicator of the health of the child. It turns out that this first stool that happens in the first 24 hours or so after birth, when that's been analyzed for microplastics, there too you find microplastics and nanoplastics. And that's really got people concerned, because what this means is that microplastics and nanoplastics that mothers are ingesting, or that they somehow have lodged in their bodies, are making their way to the fetus. The real question is, how detrimental are these microplastics and nanoplastics? And then of course we can talk about where they're coming from specifically in ways that you can control and limit. And when I say control and limit, what we're really talking about here is, yes, trying to limit your exposure to these things. If I were to rattle off the different sources of microplastics and nanoplastics, you would go wide-eyed, and you would probably also just say, okay, I surrender. They're truly everywhere. In fact, I'll do that. Okay, I can't help but do that. But keep in mind, you do have some control in terms of the end result of these microplastics and nanoplastics on your health. So here I go. Plastic bags, storage containers, bottle caps, rope gear, strapping, utensils, cups, floats, coolers, containers, rope, fishing nets, textiles. Sorry, I'm not laughing because it's funny. I'm laughing because it's just pretty much everywhere. Latex paint, coatings, medical devices, automotive parts, tires on the road, degrading, giving off little microplastics into the air, microplastics raining down from the sky, literally. Pipe, film containers, laminated safety glass, car windshields. Oh, great. Even the car windshield. Drinking bottles, textile fibers, resins, paints, varnish, construction, automotive parts. Okay, so basically everywhere, right? These things are everywhere. So what are we to do? Well, what we are to do is to limit the long-term accumulation of microplastics and nanoplastics in our system. There are ways that we can limit their introduction to our system, but as long as you're breathing, as long as you're walking around, as long as you're near a road, you are exposed to microplastics. So until there's a huge movement to make better tires that don't degrade as quickly, or to create filters in our home environments that remove the microplastics, which frankly, I think both of those things are not reasonable expectations, at least not in this lifetime. Well, until then, what you can do is you can try and limit their entry and accumulation into your body. So I'll tell you right now that a few ways that you can really do yourself a service in limiting your exposure to microplastics is to limit your consumption of water from plastic bottles. Okay, that might seem kind of obvious, but check out these data. This is pretty wild. There was an analysis of the number of microplastic and nanoplastic particles in bottled water, and it was estimated that there were about 30,000 of these particles per liter of water. Okay, and those data stood for quite a long time. Then imaging techniques for measuring the number of these different particles, in particular the really small nanoparticles, the ones that are less than 1 micron in diameter, the imaging tools for those improved. Okay, and I'll explain a little bit about that in a moment. And there was a paper published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2024 that showed that the amount of nanoplastic in particular, but microplastic and nanoplastics that are present in bottled water was actually vastly underestimated in that previous study. Rather than 30,000 particles per liter, the reanalysis with better methods showed that it was anywhere from 110 all the way up to 400,000 particles per liter. And the average was 240,000 particles per liter. So that means that the amount of microplastics and nanoplastics in bottled water is actually much, much higher than we initially thought. And a very simple way to limit your exposure to microplastics and nanoplastics is to avoid drinking water from plastic bottles, in particular plastic bottles that have been heated up. Now you might say, well, I don't heat up my plastic water bottles. Right, but you don't know what happened to those plastic water bottles en route to the store you bought them at, or en route to your refrigerator, right? They could have sat in the back of a hot truck, they could have sat in the back of a loading dock, any number of different things. Now, this is not to say that if you drink the occasional water out of a plastic bottle that you're going to harm your health. I'm absolutely not saying that. However, it's pretty clear that there's a lot of microplastics and nanoplastics that are completely avoidable, at least avoidable in terms of your ingestion of them, in plastic water bottles. The other thing is to sweat, okay? We vastly underestimate or downgrade the power of sweating. Sweating is an incredible mechanism. Now, I realize that as soon as somebody says sweating is a great way to remove toxins from the body, that a bunch of people out there get really inflamed, pun intended. I'm not saying that. What I am saying is that there are a number of different ways for foreign products to leave the body, including urine, feces, but including sweat. Okay, so I'm not saying that's going to detox you completely. That's not what I'm saying. Okay, I don't fall into that camp. However, there are a number of beneficial aspects to sweating. And also there are a number of beneficial aspects to doing the things that make you sweat. So I've done entire episodes about deliberate heat exposure. So things like sauna, done anywhere from once a week to 4 times a week. Pretty impressive data in terms of reducing all-cause mortality, improving cardiovascular function. It's also for most people pretty pleasant to sit in a sauna. If you don't have access to a sauna, taking a hot bath, not so hot that you burn yourself, but a hot bath that also will activate some of these same pathways. Things like hot yoga, things like going out for a run in a hoodie, trying to get your body to sweat pretty robustly at least once a week is a good idea for all sorts of reasons. Also just your ability to thermoregulate. By the way, for those of you that don't sweat much, sweating is actually something that you can get better at. That's right. You can get better at sweating by what? By sweating, by exposing yourself in safe ways to heat. Why am I talking about this? Well, sweating may help remove some of the things that are attached to microplastics and nanoplastics that can act as endocrine disruptors. It's very, very unlikely that the microplastics and nanoplastics would actually be removed as whole particles in sweat. I think that's very unlikely, frankly. What's more likely is that the microplastics and nanoplastics aren't really getting removed from or broken down within our body at all. They're getting lodged into these different tissues, but the stuff that's on them and in them is potentially causing some of the biological harms that we've talked about. And so removing those more robustly is what sweating is about, and so on and so forth.
Thanks for watching. If you found this information helpful, be sure to like, share, and subscribe for more health and wellness tips.